As I'm sure you're aware, Labour have taken a rather strong pivot on their rhetoric towards mass migration recently. Whereas before, if you contended that mass migration was some kind of open borders experiment that was meant to harm the native population of Britain, then you would have been called a bigoted conspiracy theorist, and if you dared to go out and protest the direct consequences of this mass migration open borders experiment, then Keir Starmer himself would have had you arrested and fast-tracked into the nearest prison cell. Despite this, Keir Starmer recently came out and confirmed that all of those conspiracy theories were true, coming out in a speech and saying exactly those words, that open borders were an experiment conducted by the Tories. Now, of course, he left out that they were begun under the Tony Blair government of 1997, but still, it's a step in the right direction after they're trying to reform their terrible image that they've garnered over the first few months of Labour's time in government. Despite this, Labour still have some massive problems moving forward. The main one being that it's all well and good to reform your rhetoric and start to talk a tough game. The problem is that you've got to eventually put those words into action. And another problem is that they have a very, very idiotic and unintelligent Deputy Prime Minister, that being Angela Rayner, who reveals that the facade of tough rhetoric against mass migration may simply be exactly what it appears to be, a facade, a veil put over the eyes of the public to trick them into going back to being complacent, back to being comfortable and thinking that nothing is going on. Now, how does this happen? Well, we've seen recently that actually Labour do seem to be trying to take a bit more of a tough tact. They are deporting people, supposedly. They have reduced mass migration numbers from last year, even though the numbers from last year were revised up in advance for this. And who knows if the numbers that we've got this year are going to be revised up next year. But they've also taken the recent step after the fall of the Assad regime to prevent or to postpone asylum decisions for Syrian refugees. So it appears that they are trying to do something. The problem is, again, Angela Rayner kind of gives the game away. Now, what does this relate to? This relates to the fact that we have a housing crisis in this country. Even before it was revealed that mass migration was an open borders experiment, we already knew that there was a housing crisis that you kind of had to assume was down to foreign billionaires buying up lots of property across the country, which, you know, they do that, and I'm not a fan of that, I don't agree with that, but I think it had rather more to do with the millions of new people who are coming into this country every year. Again, as of last year, the new numbers have been revised up from, I think, around 700 and something thousand to 909,000, almost a million people in net total into this country. So of course that's going to put a massive strain on the housing market because there's only so much supply that cannot keep up with such a massive increase in demand. So what are Labour doing? Well, what Labour are doing is they say they're going to build 1.5 million new homes over the next 5 years. Now, by itself, that won't really do that much because as of last year, you still had almost a million people come in over a single 12-month period alone. So obviously, over the course of 5 years, will not be able to catch up. That's not to mention all of the problems that we're having with local councils, saying that these are just unrealistic targets to try and hit. But still, there is an even bigger problem, which is for all of the talk of being tough on illegal immigration, deporting people, reducing the numbers down from, potentially almost a million per year net to something much lower, they're still going to be importing a hell of a lot of people into the country. And that's where this recent interview that Angela Rayner was conducting on Sky News with Trevor Phillip comes in. Because Trevor Phillip had the gall to ask the pretty reasonable question of, well, you have 1.5 new million homes that you're planning to build over the next 5 years, but it appears that according to the government's own projections, that you're going to be having about 2.5 million new people into the country in that same time period. Now, of course, we're not expecting that each of these individuals will need a full home to themselves, but still, if the whole point is to catch up the supply to meet the demand, why are you still increasing the demand by such an absurd amount? Let's see what Angela Rayner herself had to say on the matter.
All right, let me ask you about another element of this. On the present densities, you're going to add 3.4 million, or homes for 3.4 million people with your 1.5 million houses. On your own figures, we're also going to add to our population 2.5 million people over this same period. Are you content that more than 5 out of 7 new homes will go to immigrants?
Well, that's not the truth, and that's not the case.
What will happen.
Well, that's not the reality, because
where the 2.5 million immigrants that are in Rachel Reeves' budget figures going to turn up? Where are they going to live?
Well, there's plenty of housing in the UK, but the houses, especially social
hang on. You can't, on the one hand, say we've got to build this 1.5 million houses, and then say there's plenty of housing already.
There is plenty of housing, Trevor, already, but there's not enough for the people that desperately need it. So the homes...
There you go. Sounds a little bit contradictory, doesn't it? Well, we've got this housing crisis, which is why we're building these 1.5 million homes. This government delivers for the people. But at the same time, actually, when it comes to importing in millions of people into the country over a particular period of time, we've got plenty of homes. Now, if there's one thing that this reveals outside of Angela Rayner simply not understanding the problem or not understanding how to sell the solution to the public, is that beyond solving any problems, managerial liberal democracy, as it has existed for quite a long time at this point, seems to prioritise above all else mass migration of particularly non-Europeans into European nations. Now, there's been a populist uprising, some say, across some European nations to try and prevent this, but overwhelmingly, this seems to be the direction that this type of governance pushes policy in. It's unavoidable. We have a housing crisis, we're building all of these homes, and yet still, for some reason, to fill up skills gaps, we need these millions of people into the country. And that was an open borders experiment. There was obviously terrible consequences for the people, which is why I'm throwing the previous government under the bus, rightfully so, over their failure to address it. And yet, at the same time, we're only slowing it down a little bit, enough that we can say we've reduced it by X percentage, and then carry on and try and placate the public with that. Now, something shocking about this is that even under the Tories, you've got to realise that 2.5 million people over the course of 5 years is still a ridiculous number of people. That's only something that really became possible following the Boris wave after Brexit had been completed. So if you go back to some government documents here, you can see that it says across an 8-year period from 2013 to 2020, the net migration of EU nationals was 1.69 million people. Non-EU migration was 880,000 people. So over the course of 8 years, it was about 2.56 million people altogether. So we've even sped up from the Tories, who were easily the worst government for this kind of mass migration that we've ever experienced in British history. And that's not to even come on to the problem of the fact that local councils, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, are basically saying that these kinds of projections, 1.5 million homes, are ridiculous. They're completely unrealistic. There's no way that most councils are going to be able to actually fulfill these because, well, one, a lot of the properties that they want to build are on greenbelt land, so that'll mean paving over fields and areas of national beauty. Then there's also the cultural problem of building 1,000 homes in a new area and plopping in, thousands, potentially thousands of strangers into your local community who, even if they're not foreign, can have a massive effect on local culture. And then there's also the fact that a lot of these new estates that are popping up, I've seen it myself, are popping up in the middle of nowhere. So this affordable housing, which isn't actually affordable if you look at the cost of it, it's just that most of the homes will be sold on part ownership basis for mortgages. A lot of this new housing is built in very rural areas away from population centres where there's infrastructure like shops. A lot of these estates are kind of in the sticks and don't even have a single shop on them, which is a massive planning oversight if you ask me. But I believe the regulations mean that you only have to build a shop if there's a certain amount of people there. So a lot of this new property is going to people who'll move in, have a home for a couple of years perhaps, and then say, this is really inconvenient, the building quality of these new homes is quite poor, I'm going to move elsewhere if I can. So a lot of this new housing, as we've seen on the podcast, is not up to standards. And again, even Keir Starmer has said building 1.5 million homes is ambitious, a little too ambitious perhaps, and the councils are saying that we are these new targets are absolutely impossible, they are unrealistic, we cannot deliver on these targets. So what this essentially means is that 1.5 million new homes is a dream, it is a fantasy, but 2.5 million new immigrants, well, we can do that easily. It's very easy to get people into this country and housed in housing that should have really gone to people who were already in this country, or get them into social housing. Either way, all of that puts another massive strain on housing demand, making housing prices go up. So Angela Rayner's maths regarding this is terrible. The Labour Party's plans are unrealistic. Ideally, this government and the Tories should all disband. They should disband their parties, hang their heads in shame, hold up their wrists so that they can be arrested and put to trial for treason towards this country, and hopefully at that point we can start to rebuild better in the future. But until then, I suppose we're stuck with this. Thanks for watching.